If someone had asked me a year ago whether I trusted my fiancé, I wouldn't have hesitated for even a second. Laura Clark was the kind of woman people described as put together. Calm, sharp, always one step ahead of everyone else in the room. She worked in corporate consulting and spent most of her days dealing with executives, investors, and people who talked about numbers that made my head spin. But when she was home with me, she was different. Softer, warmer. We had been together for 4 years. Engaged for 1. Our wedding was scheduled for early fall. At least that was the plan. Looking back now, it's strange how clearly I remember the exact moment things started to feel wrong. It happened during a corporate dinner in Chicago. Laura had invited me because, as she put it, everyone keeps asking about you. I should probably prove you actually exist. I wasn't really excited about it. Corporate dinners always feel like a weird mix of business meeting and social performance. But Laura seemed happy that I was coming, so I went. The restaurant was one of those upscale downtown places with soft lighting, polished wood tables, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. The kind of place where the waiters glide instead of walk and every drink somehow costs $20. Laura looked incredible that night. She wore a simple black dress and had her hair tied back in a loose style that made her look both professional and elegant at the same time. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that I had somehow gotten extremely lucky. Most of the people there were her co-workers, consultants, analysts, project managers. Everyone dressed sharply, speaking in that confident, polished tone people develop after years in corporate environments. Laura introduced me around the table. Daniel, this is Megan from Strategy. Daniel, this is Victor. He runs one of the finance teams. There were polite smiles, handshakes, and the usual small talk. Everything felt completely normal. First, about 20 minutes into the evening, the door to the private dining room opened. A man walked in. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. Not flashy, but expensive in the way you could recognize instantly if you'd ever spent time around corporate leadership. The room shifted slightly when he entered. A few people straightened in their chairs. 2 conversations stopped mid-sentence. Clearly someone important had just arrived. I didn't know who he was, but Laura did. And the moment she saw him, something about her changed. It wasn't dramatic. If you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it. But I was sitting right next to her. Her posture stiffened slightly. Her smile faded for a moment before she forced it back. And the hand that had been resting casually on the table near mine slowly pulled away. The man began greeting people around the room. Short conversations, firm handshakes, quiet confidence. When he finally reached our side of the table, Laura stood up almost immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice sounded different. Not scared exactly, but tighter, controlled. The man smiled at her in a way that suggested they already knew each other very well. Laura, just her name. No introduction, no explanation. Then he looked at me. "And you must be?" "Daniel," I said, standing up and shaking his hand. Laura's fiancé. His handshake was strong, deliberate. The kind of handshake someone gives when they're used to being the person in charge. But the thing that stuck with me wasn't the handshake. It was the look he gave Laura immediately afterward. It lasted maybe half a second, but it felt familiar, like the kind of look people exchange when they've shared more than just workplace conversations. I brushed the thought away immediately. People read too much into things all the time. I told myself I was probably doing the same. Dinner continued. Wine was poured. Conversations restarted. Someone told a story about a disastrous client meeting that had everyone laughing. But as the night went on, I began noticing small details. Laura avoided looking directly at Mr. Carter most of the evening. Yet she always seemed aware of where he was in the room. And he looked at her far more often than he needed to. Not constantly, but enough that it started to stand out. About 40 minutes later, people began standing up and moving around. The dinner had turned into one of those networking situations where everyone holds a drink and drifts between small conversations. I had stepped over to the bar area to grab another drink when something caught my attention. Laura was standing near one of the large windows, talking to another coworker. Mr. Carter walked past her. As he did, his hand lightly touched the middle of her back. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't lingering. It lasted maybe a second. But the gesture looked incredibly natural. The kind of small physical contact people make when they're already used to being in each other's space. Laura froze for a fraction of a second when it happened. Then she stepped slightly away. Most people in the room didn't notice. But I did. And suddenly the entire evening felt different. Later that night, we drove home together through the quiet Chicago streets. For most of the ride, we talked about normal things. Work, wedding plans, a vacation we had been discussing for after the honeymoon. But the image of that moment near the window kept replaying in my head. Eventually I said it. "Your boss seems pretty comfortable around you." Laura glanced over at me from the passenger seat. "What do you mean?" "Carter," I said. "He seems familiar with you." She let out a small sigh. "Daniel, please don't start imagining things." "I'm not imagining anything," I said carefully. "It just looked like you two know each other pretty well." She laughed softly. "You're being jealous over nothing." Then she added something that made me feel like the awkward one in the situation. "He's my boss. Of course we know each other." That was the end of the conversation, at least on the surface. But when we got home, something strange happened. Laura walked straight into the bathroom without saying much. She stayed in there for almost 15 minutes. When she finally came out, she looked like someone who had just finished a very stressful phone call. I asked if everything was okay. She smiled, said she was just tired, and went to bed. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking everything. Looking back now, that dinner in Chicago was the first moment I realized something in my relationship wasn't what I thought it was. And it was only the beginning. For the next few days after the corporate dinner, nothing seemed obviously wrong. Laura went to work like usual. We had dinner together in the evenings, talked about normal things, watched a show before bed. If someone had asked me then whether anything in my life felt unstable, I probably would have said no. But something small had changed inside my head. That moment at the restaurant kept replaying in my mind. The way Mr. Carter had said her name. The way his hand touched her back like it was a completely natural thing to do. At first I told myself I was just being paranoid. But once a thought like that appears, it has a way of slowly spreading. About a week later I noticed the first real change. Laura started coming home later. Her job had always been demanding, so late evenings weren't unusual. But before that dinner she usually texted me if she was going to be delayed. Now she didn't. One Tuesday I checked the clock and realized it was almost 9. I sent her a message. "Everything okay?" She replied about 10 minutes later. "Yeah. Just finishing up some things at the office." The message felt normal enough, but when she came home an hour later she looked unusually tired. Not physically exhausted, more like mentally distracted. While we ate dinner, she kept checking her phone. At first I assumed it was work. Then I noticed something else. Her phone was on silent. Laura had never kept her phone on silent before. She worked with clients constantly and always said she needed to hear incoming messages. Now it sat face down on the table, the screen lighting up every few minutes without a sound. I tried to ignore it, but once you notice something like that, it becomes impossible to unsee. A few days later I saw another small detail. We were sitting on the couch watching TV when her phone buzzed again. She picked it up quickly and stood. "I just need to answer this," she said. Then she walked into the hallway. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When she came back, she acted like nothing had happened. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said casually. "Just work stuff." Something about the answer felt rehearsed. That night, after she went to sleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about the dinner, about Carter, about the way Laura had reacted when I mentioned him in the car. Over the next 2 weeks, more strange things started appearing. Small things, but together they started forming a pattern. Laura began locking her phone. Before, she never used a password. One evening I picked it up absent-mindedly to check the time. The screen asked for a passcode. That alone made my stomach tighten. Then there were the expenses. Laura and I shared access to our financial accounts because we were planning the wedding together. One night, I logged into our banking app to check a payment for the venue. That's when I noticed something odd. Several charges from restaurants I didn't recognize. Not cheap places either. Upscale downtown spots. I clicked on the dates. 2 of them matched evenings when Laura had told me she was working late. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a work meeting. Maybe clients had been in town. But if that was the case, why hadn't she mentioned it? Laura used to tell me everything about her workdays. The good meetings. The annoying clients. The ridiculous office politics. Now those stories had disappeared. Instead, she started talking about something else. Her colleagues. More specifically, the successful ones. Carter closed another massive deal this week, she said casually one night while scrolling through her phone. That guy works non-stop. Another evening, she mentioned a partner from another department who had just bought a new penthouse downtown. Some of the people at the firm are on another level, she said. She didn't say anything directly wrong, but the tone had changed. There was admiration in her voice, almost fascination. Meanwhile, something else had quietly disappeared from our relationship. Interest. Laura stopped asking about my day. When I talked about my projects or work problems, she listened politely but seemed distracted. Sometimes she would nod without really responding. Other times she would check her phone halfway through the conversation. One night I stopped mid-sentence just to see if she would notice. She didn't. She kept scrolling. That was the moment a thought hit me harder than anything else had. Maybe I wasn't imagining things. Maybe all these little details were connected. Late nights. The silent phone. The password. The expensive dinners she never mentioned. The way Carter's name kept coming up in conversation. For the first time, the possibility entered my mind clearly. What if the dinner in Chicago hadn't been the beginning? What if it had just been the first moment I noticed something that had already started? I tried to push the thought away. Accusing someone you love of something like that without proof can destroy everything. But the more I looked back at the last few weeks, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. Then something happened that made the situation impossible to dismiss anymore. One evening, Laura told me she had another late meeting. It was a Thursday. She kissed me quickly before leaving. "Don't wait up," she said. "I might be late." Around 9:30, I opened the banking app again to check a payment reminder. That's when I saw it. Another charge. From a hotel in downtown Chicago. The same night she had told me she'd be working late. And suddenly every strange detail from the past few weeks stopped feeling like coincidence. Instead, it started looking like a story. A story I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. After I saw the hotel charge, I didn't close the banking app right away. I just sat there at the kitchen table staring at the screen, reading the same line over and over again like maybe the numbers would suddenly change. They didn't. It was a payment from a hotel in downtown Chicago. Not a small place either. One of those modern business hotels where executives stay when they're in the city for conferences or client meetings. The amount wasn't huge, but it wasn't something you accidentally pay for either. I checked the date again. Thursday night. The same night Laura had kissed me quickly at the door and told me she had a late meeting. My first instinct was still to explain it away. Maybe it was for a client. Maybe she booked a room for someone visiting from out of town. Maybe the company reimbursed it later. But the longer I stared at it, the harder those explanations became to believe. Because there was something else. This wasn't the first charge. I scrolled back through the transaction history again. There were 3 others. Same hotel. Different dates. All of them on evenings when Laura had told me she was working late. That was the moment my chest started feeling tight. Not panic exactly. More like the slow realization that something you didn't want to be true might actually be real. I closed the app and leaned back in the chair. For a few minutes, I just sat there in silence. The house was quiet. Laura wouldn't be home for at least another hour. And for the first time since we had gotten engaged, I felt something I had never felt toward her before. Doubt. I tried to focus on something else. Turned on the television. Opened my laptop. But my mind kept going back to the same place. The dinner in Chicago. Carter. The way Laura's phone had suddenly become private. The expensive restaurants she never mentioned. And now the hotel. Around 10:30, I heard the front door open. Laura walked in looking slightly tired but otherwise normal. "Hey," she said casually, setting her bag on the chair. "Sorry I'm late." "Long meeting?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, slipping off her shoes. "One of the clients keeps changing the numbers." Turned into a whole thing. She walked over and kissed me on the cheek like she always did when she came home late. Everything about her behavior looked completely natural. Too natural. "Did you eat?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Good," she replied. "I'm exhausted." Then she disappeared into the bedroom to change. I stayed on the couch staring at the dark TV screen. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately. Just say it. Ask why there were hotel charges matching the nights she claimed to be working. But another part of me stopped that idea. Because once you ask a question like that, there's no going back. Either the answer destroys everything, or you become the paranoid fiancé accusing the woman you love of something she didn't do. So instead, I said nothing. Over the next few days, I started doing something I never thought I would do in my own relationship. I started paying attention. Carefully. Quietly. The next time Laura told me she would be working late, I wrote down the date. 2 days later, I checked the bank account again. Another restaurant charge appeared. Downtown Chicago. Same pattern as before. I opened a map on my laptop. The restaurant was less than 3 blocks away from the hotel that kept appearing in our statements. My stomach dropped. Still, I didn't say anything. I needed to be absolutely sure. Because if I was wrong, accusing her would destroy our relationship anyway. And if I was right, then the relationship might already be gone. A week later, another late night happened. "Client dinner," Laura said while putting on her coat. "Don't wait up." She left around 7. At 8:30, I checked the account again. Nothing yet, but something inside me told me to look somewhere else. Instead of checking the transactions, I opened a map. Then I did something I had never imagined myself doing. I grabbed my keys. The hotel from the statements was only a 15-minute drive away. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd drive by, see nothing, and feel stupid for even thinking about it. But I still got in the car. The city lights blurred past the windshield as I drove downtown. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. Not because I wanted to catch her doing something wrong, but because I was terrified that I might. When I pulled into the street near the hotel, I almost turned around. Almost. But then I saw something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Laura's car, parked in the lot across from the entrance. I stared at it for a long moment. Maybe she was meeting a client inside. Maybe this was a coincidence. Maybe. Then the hotel doors opened, and a familiar tall man in a navy suit stepped outside. Carter. A few seconds later, Laura walked out behind him. They were laughing about something, completely relaxed, like two people who had spent a comfortable evening together. He said something I couldn't hear. Laura smiled. Then he placed his hand lightly on her back. The same place I had seen him touch her during the corporate dinner. Only this time she didn't move away. And in that moment, every doubt I had been trying to ignore finally disappeared, because there was no room left for doubt anymore. For a few seconds after seeing them walk out of the hotel, I couldn't move. My hands were still on the steering wheel, but it felt like my brain had temporarily stopped processing anything beyond the image in front of me. Laura, Carter, standing under the warm yellow lights of the hotel entrance like two people who had just finished a pleasant evening together. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No kissing, no obvious affection, just comfort, familiarity, the kind of relaxed body language people have when they've spent enough time together that being close feels normal. That was somehow worse. If I had seen something explosive, something obvious, maybe I would have reacted differently. Maybe I would have stormed inside. Maybe I would have confronted them right there. But instead I just sat there in the car watching. Carter said something that made Laura laugh quietly. Then he touched her back again, guiding her slightly toward the parking lot. The exact same gesture I had seen weeks earlier at the corporate dinner. Only this time she didn't freeze. She didn't step away. She leaned slightly toward him. They stopped walking for a moment and continued talking. Two people in no hurry to end the evening. My chest felt heavy. Not like anger. Not yet. More like the slow realization that something important in my life had just quietly collapsed. After another minute, they separated. Carter walked toward a black sedan, waiting near the curb. Laura walked across the street toward the parking lot where her car was parked. For a second, I thought about starting the engine and driving away before she noticed me. But the angle of the street made that impossible. Instead, I stayed perfectly still as she unlocked her car door. She never looked in my direction. A moment later, her headlights turned on and she pulled out of the lot. I waited another 30 seconds before starting my car. Then I drove home. The entire ride back felt strangely calm. Not because the situation was calm, but because the worst part, the uncertainty, was over. The doubt was gone. I had seen enough. Laura wasn't just working late. She wasn't just having professional dinners. She was meeting him. And judging by how comfortable they looked together, it probably hadn't started recently. When I walked into the house, everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The couch, the kitchen counter, the framed photo from our engagement trip sitting on the shelf. It was strange how normal everything looked. About 20 minutes later, the front door opened. Laura stepped inside. "Hey," she said casually. "Hey," I replied. She set her purse down and slipped off her coat. "Sorry I'm late again," she said. "Client meeting ran longer than expected." The words came out smoothly, without hesitation, like a line she had repeated several times already. I watched her for a moment. There was no guilt in her expression, no nervousness. If I hadn't seen what I saw earlier, I might have believed her. "Long day?" she asked. "Yeah," I said quietly. She nodded, poured herself a glass of water, and sat down on the couch. For a few minutes we talked about completely normal things. Her office schedule, a wedding vendor who had emailed us earlier, a friend who might not be able to attend the ceremony. Listening to her speak felt surreal, because now I knew something she didn't know I knew, and that changed everything. That night I didn't confront her, not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had already started thinking differently. Exploding emotionally would feel good for a few minutes, but it wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't protect me financially. It wouldn't explain how long this had been going on. And it definitely wouldn't stop someone like Carter from simply walking away untouched. So instead, I did something Laura probably never expected from me. I stayed calm. Over the next few days, I began quietly collecting information. Not spying dramatically, just paying attention. I took *TS of the hotel charges, saved copies of the restaurant payments, started writing down dates when Laura claimed to be working late. Then I compared them with the financial records. The pattern was clearer than I had expected. The hotel appeared in the statements almost every second week, always on evenings when Laura said she had late meetings. And the restaurants nearby appeared on many of the same nights, which meant one thing: this wasn't new. This had probably been happening for months. The more I documented, the calmer I became. Not because I accepted the situation, but because I was slowly understanding it. And once you understand a situation completely, you can start deciding how to deal with it. A week later, I discovered something else. Carter wasn't just Laura's boss. He was married, which meant the situation wasn't just messy. It was fragile. And suddenly an idea started forming in my mind. Not revenge. Something better. Conversation. But not with Laura. With him. Because if Carter believed he had quietly taken my place, he was about to learn he had underestimated the situation. And more importantly, he had underestimated me. Once the idea formed in my head, I didn't rush it. Rushing would only make mistakes more likely. Instead, I spent the next several days preparing carefully, quietly documenting everything, organizing the information I had gathered, and making sure that when the moment came, I would be the one controlling the situation. The strange thing was how calm I felt during that time. A week earlier, I had been confused, angry, trying to convince myself that maybe I was misinterpreting everything. Now there was no confusion left, just clarity. And clarity has a way of replacing panic with focus. By that point, I had compiled a simple but very clear timeline. Hotel payments, restaurant charges, dates Laura claimed she was working late. Even the night I had seen them walk out of the hotel together. Everything lined up. It wasn't emotional evidence. It was factual, which made it far more powerful. But the most interesting discovery I made during that time had nothing to do with Laura. It was about Carter. Through a little digging, I learned something that made the entire situation far more delicate for him than it was for me. Carter was married. Not quietly separated. Not recently divorced. Married. Publicly. His wife appeared in several corporate photos online from company events. She was active in charity boards and social functions connected to the firm. Which meant one thing. If his relationship with Laura became public inside the company, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could become a serious professional problem. And the moment I realized that, I understood something else. Carter probably believed he had the upper hand. After all, he was the powerful executive. The successful one. The man who probably assumed the fiancée at home would never figure anything out. But he was wrong. And I intended to make that very clear. 3 days later, I sent him an email. I kept it simple. Professional. Hello, Mr. Carter. I'd like to discuss something important regarding Laura Clark. I believe a short private conversation would be beneficial for both of us. Let me know when you're available. Daniel. I didn't include any accusations. No emotional language. Just enough information to make him curious. The reply came the next morning. Short. Direct. What exactly is this about? I waited 2 hours before answering. Long enough to make him think. It's something that concerns both of us. A quick conversation would clear things up. Another hour passed. Then his response appeared. Come to my office tomorrow at 4. Perfect. The next afternoon I arrived at the corporate building where Laura worked. The lobby alone looked expensive enough to confirm everything I had assumed about the company. Glass walls, polished marble floors, people walking quickly between elevators with that familiar corporate urgency. The receptionist directed me upstairs. Carter's office was on one of the higher floors. Corner office. Large windows. Exactly the kind of space you'd expect someone like him to occupy. When I walked in, he was standing near the desk looking over a tablet. He didn't offer his hand this time. Instead, he studied me for a moment. So, he said calmly, you wanted to talk about Laura. His tone suggested he was mildly annoyed but not particularly concerned. He probably assumed this was about wedding logistics or something equally harmless. I closed the door behind me. Then I placed a thin folder on the desk. He glanced at it but didn't open it yet. What is this? He asked. Information, I said, about the last few months. He finally picked up the folder and opened it. Inside were printed copies of the financial records, hotel charges, restaurant receipts, dates and times neatly organized. I watched his expression as he flipped through the pages. The confidence in his posture faded slightly. Not dramatically, but enough. He set the papers down slowly, then looked at me. What exactly are you suggesting? He asked. His voice was controlled, but it wasn't as relaxed as before. I'm not suggesting anything, I said. I'm showing you a timeline. Silence filled the office for a moment. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. You followed her, he said. Eventually. He studied me carefully, trying to understand what kind of man was sitting across from him. What do you want? He asked. The question came quickly, directly. That told me something important. He already understood the situation. People who believe they're innocent ask for explanations. People who know they've been caught ask what it will cost. I leaned forward slightly. First, I said calmly, I want you to understand something. This situation can become extremely complicated for a lot of people. His jaw tightened slightly. But, I continued, it doesn't have to. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he spoke again. What exactly are you proposing? I looked directly at him. No more contact with Laura. Immediately and permanently, he stared at me for a moment, as if measuring whether I was bluffing. I wasn't. And if I refuse? He asked. I tapped the folder lightly. Then these documents might start appearing in places that would make your life very uncomfortable. For the first time since the conversation began, Carter looked genuinely unsettled, because he finally understood something he hadn't expected. This wasn't an emotional confrontation. This was a negotiation, and the leverage wasn't on his side. After a long moment, he spoke quietly. "You're serious?" "Yes." Another pause. Then he nodded once. "Fine." Just like that. The conversation was over. But as I stood to leave, he said something else. "Does Laura know about this meeting?" I stopped near the door, then answered honestly, "No." And that was the truth. Because the next conversation I needed to have was with her. The next few days felt strangely quiet. Laura still talked about work like nothing had changed, but something in her tone was different. Carter's name never came up again. Then one evening she came home looking tense, almost confused. "Something weird happened today," she said. Carter barely spoke to me, like I didn't exist. I just nodded. I already knew why. The connection she thought was secret had ended overnight, and she had no idea who had closed the door. A week later, the tension finally cracked. Laura sat across from me at the kitchen table, frustrated and restless. "I think something's going on at work," she admitted. I looked at her calmly. "There is," I said. Then I slid the printed hotel charges across the table. Her face went pale as she recognized the dates. The silence that followed felt heavy and final. In that moment she realized two things at once. Her secret was gone, and so was the future we were supposed to have together.